lot of times people will look at Mao and they'll say, oh my God, he murdered a bunch of people. And then you find out that some of them were landlords, and you kind of was like, okay. So, like, you know. So can you give us a little, sorry, can you guys give us a little bit of background about the claims about Mao being some massive, horrible Chinese dictator? I know it's a yellow peril type of BS. So let's just debunk some of that.
Yeah, interestingly, a lot of the people were landlords, but not even landlords like we think of in America, because like I said, China was a semi-feudal country. So they had these like dictatorial feudal lords who owned the land and like lorded over the people and would torture the people and exploit the peasants for their labor for years and years and years and years. And it wasn't Mao who ordered the execution of them. It was the people who had been subjugated by these landlords for years who were like, no, we're not letting them go. We're going to kill some of these. And they executed like over 100 of them. But it was the peasants who wanted to do it, not Mao. Now, China needed to go ahead with these industrialization projects because they wanted to industrialize agriculture and move forward towards a modernized mode of production. So Mao launched what's called the Great Leap Forward, which is where you saw like these things like the backyard furnaces, which became notorious in the West. They were mocked by Western propagandists. You know, Mao tried to set up all these furnaces in people's backyard so they could make steel. Look at all these stupid Chinese people. They don't know how to make steel like us Americans. They're so dumb. But what they were doing with those backyard furnaces were teaching the peasants to work with steel, teaching the peasants to work with industry, because they didn't know. 80% of the country was feudal before that. It was people who worked the land under landlords. They don't know anything about steel, nor do they have industry to produce steel, so that needed to be developed. So the backyard furnaces and the quotas put on them were to teach the peasantry how to work with industry and start producing industry. Now, at this time, the economy was highly centrally planned. It was very top-down. And Deng Xiaoping, who would go on to take over China after Mao, was arguing for a less centralized, a little bit more decentralized, less centrally planned economy that would allow for more private markets, similar to Lenin's new economic policy in the Soviet Union. So he argued for that. Now, there were famines during this time, right? Because, as we said, they were a feudal country. They were not industrialized. They were isolated by the Western nations. And there were horrible weather conditions in the first few years of the revolution that led to some famines. Now, Deng Xiaoping, in his campaign to take over the Communist Party of China, which he was democratically elected for, contrary to what you hear in the West, he was saying my economic policies, my policies that would have been more similar to Lenin's policies in the Soviet Union and less top-down, would have ameliorated the effects of the famine. There would have been less people who died in the famine if we would have gone with my policies instead of Mao. He still loved Mao. He still supported Mao. He was still part of the party and fought in the Revolutionary War with Mao. But he was arguing that my policies would have been even better than Mao's. And that's why we need to go ahead with reform and opening up, which is what they did and what created the modern China that we see today, the most advanced civilization in the world. But so he went on a campaign saying that, like, I can't remember what the exact number is. I talk about it in my video on the construction of modern China, but in his campaign, he said this many people died in the famine, less people would have died under me. So what Western historians do then is they take what Deng was saying in that campaign and they extrapolate from data and say Mao starved 40 million people, which is literally like taking the number of people Deng was saying starved during the famines and timesing it by 100. Like, it wasn't even close to that. And they'll use that against Mao. They'll say, look, people in his own party were saying that he was starving the people, but that's not what people within the Communist Party of China were saying. There was just a debate about how to run the economy. How do we run this socialist experiment? How do we go from a mostly feudal country where everyone's peasants to an industrialized superpower and what we see in China today, which is the most advanced country in the world, completely industrialized. They've abolished relative poverty. It's the first 10 years of Mao. There were famines at first, but it is the fastest increase in human life expectancy that has ever been seen in human history. And it's never been replicated. It was even faster than the Soviet Union. The way they increased literacy and decreased malnutrition and, ultimately increased people's standard of living was incredible. But what the Western press does is what they always do, hyper focus on the people who died in the famines, psychoanalyze Mao to say he created these famines on purpose because he's such a bad guy, even though we have no evidence for this, and then just ignore all the incredible advancements that were made in China at the time.
That's what it always comes down to. I mean, any history of any communist country, there are amazing things that they're able to do, especially the small ones, because they're so easily blockaded by our own ruling class, especially Cuba, right? They tried to kill Fidel Castro, was it over 600 times?
Yeah.
You have to have the love of your people for your intelligence apparatus to just be that loyal, right? To that they never let you down. They can never get to you like that. But there are so many achievements that they just spin, just like any other media spin. They used to do this during the nuclear talks in the late Soviet Union, right? Anything the Soviets would say, they would spin it negatively. So the U.S. would make an absurd demand. They would say, okay, no, we can't do that. What do you really want? And then they would say, oh, they're refusing to cooperate, right? It's things like that. I mean, in the Soviet Union, they industrialized faster than anything else in history. There's a book by William Z. Foster called Towards Soviet America. The entire first half of it covers everything they don't tell you about the achievements of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. So now we are sort of, looking at China modern day. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up, and this is something I noticed whenever I read about socialist countries, is that whenever the people, the proletariat come into power, one of the first things that usually changes is the literacy rates. It usually goes up whenever I see anything about socialist society. So whether it's the Soviet Union, whether it's the People's Republic of China, whether it is Cuba, Vietnam, places like that, the literacy rates always go up. Now, if anybody knows anything about American history, is that who was suppressed and who made it illegal for Black people to be able to read and write?
Yep.
So my 5th great grandfather died knowing how to read and write, but he didn't know how to read and write when he was little. And he was born in the 1790s. So that just goes to show that it's really more of a people center, because if we all know that knowledge is power, and if you want people to have power, then you want people to know how to read and write too. Now,
if you want people to have power.
Now, Sabs, let me ask you this. What is the average grade level, reading grade level in the United States? I think you know this fact.
I think I have to double check. Is it 3rd grade?
I think it's 6th.
6th grade.
It's 6th grade now? Okay. Well, things have improved a little bit. I remember at one point, seriously, I remember at one point it was like 3rd grade. But the thing is, like the literacy, I know when I did my observations in K through 12, that was what, at least this is in Massachusetts, so just keep that in mind. That was a heavy focus, was reading and writing. They spent most of the day learning reading and writing because of the literacy rate issue in the United States. Because I remember I was just like, where's the math? When are they going to learn math? Those kinds of things. But most of the time was spent reading and writing. So, but that's still sad.
I live in Cleveland, which is the poorest big city in the country. On the east side where I'm from, I think there's a 93% adult illiteracy rate.
Here's something
ridiculous.
Here's some interesting too. And when the Soviet Union was occupying Afghanistan, there was tons of propaganda out about that in the West. You know, most people look at it as an aggressive, violent Soviet occupation, but they were trying to stabilize the country, which had a lot of extremist groups and warlords, and help this Marxist democratic government take power and modernize Afghanistan. They had all these, you know, ideas about rights for women and teaching people to read and equal access to education. So the Soviet Union, when they occupied, they were helping launch these literacy campaigns where they were sending social workers even into the rural, most, you know, quote unquote, backwards regions of Afghanistan and teaching people to read. So what the U.S. started doing in response was heavily funding and arming Osama bin Laden, the Mujahideen extremist jihadist groups, and other extremist jihadist groups in and around Afghanistan. And what they would do was hide in Pakistan. And when literacy workers would come to the rural areas, they would cross the border and throw acid in their faces, which was, you know, part of their ideology, which was anti-woman and anti-women, you know, leaving the house and educating themselves. So that's what the Soviet Union was doing in Afghanistan, teaching people to read, while the U.S. was funding terrorists to throw acid on the faces of literacy workers. Really shows you where their intentions lie.
That whole thing was literally provoked by our CIA in the first place. There was a rapidly growing communist movement in Afghanistan at the time. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the head of the CIA at the time, wrote about this in his book, The Great Chessboard. He said his whole plan was to get the Soviets there and the revolutionaries in Afghanistan to force them to move before they were ready, which is exactly what they did. The whole thing was to, quote, give the Soviets their Vietnam, get them in this country where they can spin them as the aggressors and where they can't leave until something really catastrophic happens. Kind of like what they're doing to Russia right now.
Got it. So
one of the things I think that hurt the literacy rate too was, I don't know if everybody, Jaybe, do you remember having to read out loud in class? Yeah. Do you remember having to do that? So some schools they went away from that because they said that it can embarrass. I know, don't get me started. They went away from that because they said that it can embarrass students that may not have, you know, the best reading level, or students that may have anxiety, et cetera. But I wonder about that. And I wonder if that's why when we were growing up, maybe that's why the literacy rates were higher, because we had to do that in school. Like, we had to read aloud. And so moving away from that, I wonder how many kids sometimes sit in the classroom and they pretend like they're reading, but they're not.
Yeah. Our entire education system isn't designed to teach us. It's designed to train us to be people they can exploit, right? We're not there to really learn and understand. We're there to pass a test so we can buy a piece of paper from the bank to go get a job where we're going to spend the vast majority of our waking hours making somebody else rich.
Yeah. It's funny because I actually enjoy. Okay, it's kind of funny. I'm a contradiction because I hated reading, but I love reading out loud because I was good at it, right? Hell, I read on my channel. So for me, it's like, well, duh, of course you got to read out loud, because there's a difference between reading in your head and reading out loud. And reading out loud is more of a skill, because when you read out loud, then that means that you actually have to use inflections in your voice, sense state, modulation, things like that. And so because of the way I was raised, and I actually enjoyed reading out loud. But as Jessica Mai said, she said for her it was anxiety inducing.
Yep.
So I understand that for some people, it's like, yeah, but I think it should be more on a volunteer basis. Like, who wants to read out loud? You know what I'm saying? Some people, should be encouraged to do so. And if people who get anxiety for it, then it's like, okay, then you don't have to. But my thing is, like, the education system is really a good synopsis of telling the type of government that you have and who they prioritize the most. Because if they're not prioritizing everyone having education, especially an equality in education and equity in education, then that means that they really just don't care about the people. And just for, as an aside, for anybody who does not know any of the lingo, proletariat basically means the working masses or anyone equal to the working masses, correct?
Yes, wage laborers, specifically people who sell their labor in a market because they don't have access to means of production. Working masses could be a more general term that could include like lumpen elements or the peasantry in certain countries, but yeah.
We tend to use working classes, like plural, to include what we call the reproletariat.
Okay.
But as you learned in the class, it's always part of the contradiction, right?
Yeah.
Like, proletariat arises in different forms, in different periods, according to different characteristics. But the main thing is that it is these people that, like Eddie was just saying, work for a wage, but are prevented from doing anything other than buying means of consumption, things they immediately use, paying your rent, buying food, etc. We're unable to accumulate any forms of wealth of our own and stability. When we do that, we lose our proletarian character and begin entering the middle classes. That's a whole another bag of bananas, though.
I was hoping you'd say bag of bananas. Yes! Got it out of them.